The Bible prophesies a peace agreement will be signed between Israel and the Palestinians that will begin the final 7 years to the second coming of Jesus Christ and the Battle of Armageddon. I will provide an update on this status of this agreement on today's edition of End of the Age. There we go. Well, good afternoon, everybody. I'm Dave Robbins with Endtime Ministries. Thank you for joining me so much on this edition of End of the Age. And I'm actually sitting at my house today doing the program on my cell phone. I had to call in the office because if you know what's going on in America, Texas is on lockdown. And guess what? A lot of it may be caused from the wind turbines that are frozen, all of this green energy that we're moving towards because of the propaganda of the United Nations global warming climate change hoax. And we've moved off a lot, even in Texas, where we've got so much natural gas and oil reserves and things. We tried some of the green energy wind turbines, and those are frozen now, leaving hundreds of thousands of people, if not millions, without electricity. So those things are not necessarily ready for prime time yet, but that's a conversation for another day. I wanted to give you an update on the peace agreement that will be signed that will start the final 7 years. Daniel 9:27 prophesies of a peace agreement that will start the final 7 years to the second coming of Jesus Christ in the Battle of Armageddon. We've talked about it so many times over the years, and it's very, very important because once we hit that final 7 years, we're going to move off into a time of prophetic fulfillment. I mean, just one right after the other. Things start clicking off very fast at that point, and it's the prophecy with a date on it. You understand that once we know that this is the agreement between the Israelis and the Palestinians, and it has all the 5 characteristics of the prophesied peace agreement, we will have started the final 7 years to the second coming of Jesus Christ. Things I've heard about my entire life, and we are the generation that will live through that, should the Lord tarry for us, and possibly not call some of us home early. But over the years, there have been many peace initiatives, and many of you know about this: the Oslo Peace Accords, the Wye River Accords, the Camp David Accords, Annapolis, the Roadmap for Peace, the Obama administration's peace initiative with John Kerry back in 2015, 2016 in there, President Trump's peace deal. And now the United Nations is calling for the Middle East Quartet to get involved with an international initiative for peace and all of this is the peace between the Israelis and the Palestinians, because a lot of people view this as the major conflict in the Middle East. Some even more than Iran and the situation going on there, even though Iran is the number one state sponsor of terrorism. And so there are there are many peace initiatives that have been put in place over the years, but none of them have resulted in the prophesied peace agreement. I mean, my father-in-law, Irvin Baxter, lived through every single one of these. And, of course, he's following this every day. Will it be the Oslo Peace Accords? Will it be the Wye River Accords? Will it be Camp David? But none of them were the deal that ended up being the one that would start the final 7 years. So we're still watching that. But I wanted to give you an update of kind of where we're at on the peace deal or a peace initiative right now. So I want to start with what happened to President Trump's peace deal and where we stand now. So in order to do that, so that way I can bring everybody up to speed, I want to give you some recent history. I'm going to start with World War I, and then I'm going to bring you up to date before the end of the program, because it's very important we understand all of this. Because when this event happens, this peace deal is signed between the Israelis and Palestinians, will start the final 7 years. You understand the gravity of that situation? I mean, in the middle of that final 7 years, you've got the abomination of desolation, when the Antichrist will stand in a rebuilt Jewish temple and proclaim to be God. That's when there's going to be a war in heaven, 3.5 years in, a war in heaven. Satan and his archangels, Michael and his archangels will overcome Satan and his angels and bind them to the earth. No more access to heaven. The Bible says, woe to the inhabitants of the earth, because Satan will come down unto you having great wrath. And he persecutes the woman in Revelation 12, which is Israel, and those that have the testimony of Jesus Christ, which is the church on the earth. So there's so many things, the mark of the beast, all these different things that will happen, the two witnesses, all of that happens. Israel building a third temple, all of that's going to happen during that final 7 years. So much prophetic fulfillment. And we're watching precursors to much of that happening right now. The world government, the world religion, precursors to the mark of the beast. So, you know, when people, I've seen, had people ask me questions, and I've seen interviews and things over the years where they would ask the person that's being interviewed, why are people so interested in the end time? Well, for those of us that understand about the second coming of Jesus Christ, that's what we've looked for our whole lives. And so it's very important that we understand and talk about these things. Okay, so let me bring you up to date where we're at right now, but I'm gonna have to do some history here to make sure you understand what the gravity of the situation. Back in World War I, the Ottoman Empire had captured Jerusalem. This would be in 1516 AD. The Ottoman control of the Middle East continued until World War I. With the defeat of Turkey's empire in 1917, control of the Middle East shifted to Great Britain and to France. Now, I'm going to move real quickly here through this because I want to get you up to speed. When the Holy Land came under control of the British, then influential Jews petitioned the British government to facilitate the establishment of a homeland for the Jews. On November 2nd, 1917, British Foreign Minister Arthur Balfour, he wrote to Lord Walter Rothschild, and he said, hey, His Majesty's government views with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jews and will use the best endeavors to facilitate the achievement of this objective. So this is the historical statement from the British government that became known as the Balfour Declaration. Then, of course, you have the British Mandate. So at the 1920 San Remo Conference, the victor nations of World War I assigned the mandate for Palestine to the United Kingdom under Article 22 of the Covenant of the League of Nations. So it's going to move real quick here, and then we're going to I'm going to bring you up to date, but I've had to take you through this history to make sure that you understand kind of what's going on with the West Bank area.
Major internet companies are silencing and censoring Christian voices online. These companies are trying to control what you see and hear. Almost 200 videos of ours have been marked as restricted online right now. That's why we launched End of the Age Plus, a platform where the truth won't be censored, a platform where we can preach the message of the gospel. When you subscribe to End of the Age Plus today for just $12.99 a month, you can watch all of our content in a secure, easy-to-view way from your favorite device. When you go to watch.endtime.com and subscribe, you'll get instant access to all of our teaching resources, including Revelation, the Unveiling of Jesus Christ, Understanding the End Time, End Time Magazine, and so much more. We will not censor our message to comply with what the world deems as politically correct. Go to watch.endtime.com right now or search End of the Age Plus in the App Store or Google Play.
We've seen Bible prophecy fulfilled like never before. From the halls of the United Nations to the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, End Time Ministries continues to reveal the Bible prophecy in the news headlines around the world every day. Whether it's through our broadcast or online at our Jerusalem Prophecy College, your gifts enable us to put vital materials in the hands of those who need it most. Because of you, we continue to replace fear with faith in the hearts of Christians around the world. We will continue to see prophecy come to pass at an even swifter pace. We need your support. Your donation of any amount enables us to continue to broadcast and be a voice in the ever-growing censored media. To become a partner or give a one-time gift, visit endtime.com or call 1-800-END-TIME right now. That's 800-363-8463. Go online now. Visit endtime.com.
So right after World War I, the victor nations of World War I assigned the mandate for Palestine to the United Kingdom under Article 22 of the Covenant of the League of Nations. The Allies also decided to make the UK responsible for putting into effect its own Balfour Declaration of 1917. So this action of the League of Nations, it really enshrined the Balfour Declaration into international law. Now, you probably won't be told that on the nightly news tonight, but you need to understand that. Then came Hitler's Holocaust, just the most horrible situation you can imagine. In 1939, the world's worst war broke out. And over the next 6 years, 52 million human beings met violent deaths. And among them were 6 million Jews that Adolf Hitler shipped off to concentration camps. And just when the Jewish people thought their lives couldn't get any worse, it actually did. And Hitler's gas chambers and crematoriums cruelly snuffed out young and old alike. And his goal was to rid the earth of Jews once and for all, and he called his extermination campaign the final solution. And you can still feel this you can sense this spirit in Europe. If you look online and different places, you can see where there are still, I just saw an article this morning where there are neo-Nazis that have recently been parading through streets and things like that in Europe, talking about the extermination of Jews and the Jews are the problem and things like that. It's just horrible. Anti-Semitism, the upsurge of anti-Semitism in the world, it's really precursors to the Great Tribulation that's coming. Well, then the UN votes to establish a Jewish state. So when the magnitude of Hitler's horrible Holocaust was revealed to the world, the collective guilt of the world's nations compelled them to finally grant the Jewish people a place to call home. On November 29th, 1947, the United Nations voted to partition the area of the British Mandate into an Arab state and an Israeli state. The Jews, of course, they were thrilled to have a homeland after almost 2,000 years, and being, they've been sifted through the nations, and they immediately accepted the partition plan. But the Arabs, of course, they immediately rejected the UN plan because they didn't want any Jews there in there. They didn't want a state. All they wanted was to simply eradicate the Jews out of that land there. And so after policing the area of Palestine for 28 years, the British were tired of the continual conflict between the Arabs and the Jews. All they wanted was out of it. So finally, the British announced that they were concluding the British Mandate on May 14th, 1948, and that decision would leave Palestine with no one in control, no one to keep order there. That area was called Palestine, okay? So when British forces left on May 14th, the Jews made their move. And, of course, Israel declared independence that occupied the West Bank, or Judea, Samaria, and East Jerusalem, including the Temple Mount. And Israel controlled its partitioned area, plus gains that it had made during the result of the war, because the United Nations had only given the Jews just a really small sliver of land. It was just really hardly nothing in the grand scheme of things. But yet the Jews took it because that's all they could get. And so after the War of Independence, though, they conquered some area and had a little bit more. And that included West Jerusalem. Jordan was in control of East Jerusalem, which included the Temple Mount. So so you understand that Israel's capital from 1000 BC to 70 AD, and then from this time, 1948 to present, it has been Jerusalem. It's really always been Jerusalem, but many people obviously didn't recognize it as such. So on January 23rd, 1950, Israel's Knesset passed a resolution officially stating that Jerusalem was the capital of Israel. And they didn't have control of it at this point, but they still did that. Well, during the 1967 Six Days War, Israel took control of Jerusalem and it reunited the city. On January 30, 1980, the Knesset officially annexed East Jerusalem by passing the Jerusalem Law, which declared the city to be the eternal and undivided capital of Israel. So the UN obviously they don't agree with that. They said that the Jerusalem should have been an international city under control of the United Nations. That was in the original partition plan. And of course, Israel's never going to allow that to happen. That's what the Battle of Armageddon is going to be fought over. But on August 20th, 1980, the United Nations Security Council Resolution 478 declared the Knesset's 1980 Jerusalem Law as declaring Jerusalem as Israel's eternal and indivisible capital as null and void and must be rescinded forthwith. Well, this resolution advised member states to withdraw their diplomatic representation from the city as a punitive measure. And as a result, that's why all of the nations moved their embassies to Tel Aviv. Okay? So, question is, has Jerusalem ever been the capital of another nation? Well, Jerusalem was under foreign occupation from 70 AD to 1948. East Jerusalem was under Jordanian control from 1948 to 1967. But during this span of almost, 1,897 years of foreign occupation, Jerusalem was never made the capital of any of those occupying powers. So once Israel officially declared Jerusalem to be the eternal undivided capital, the nation of the world declared this illegal and unacceptable. And so every nation on earth chooses its capital, and it is accepted by the United Nations except for one nation, and that's Israel. So now you've kind of got an overall picture. I'll bring you up to speed real quick that in 1967, Israel drove Jordan back across the Jordan Valley, and they control from that time to this what they have now. And they gave Gaza back to the Arabs under Ariel Sharon, but they still have Israel today, the West Bank, and then the Golan Heights up in the northeastern part. And so I just want to give you an idea, because that's kind of what's going on here, is that the disputed territories between the Arabs and the Israelis I should say the Palestinians, that's how you would recognize them probably better. The Palestinians and the Israelis is the West Bank area, the area that in 1967 war, they drove them out across the Jordan River, and that's where Jordan's boundaries are today. Well, the Palestinians are simply Arabs that lived there in Palestine at the time when all these wars took place and throughout from 1947 to 1967. And so that's what the two-state solution is all about. The international community says, hey, we've got to give those Arabs or quote-unquote Palestinians living that are there or were there We need to give them, many of them are still in the West Bank area. We need to give them a state. Even though the Palestinians are not a state right now, we need to give them a state, and that's called the two-state solution. The Palestinians out in the West Bank, back to 67 borders, and Israel proper, which is what they had up until 1967 in the war. So that gives you an idea what's going on. Well, now the big dispute has been Judea and Samaria. So let me bring you up to date where we're at right now. And over the last couple years, we thought that President Trump may get something done, that he would bring in possibly the United Nations, Europe, and some of these, and get something done with his peace deal. But obviously that didn't happen. So Israel Hayam, they published a great article concerning this and giving the inside details on what happened to President Trump's peace deal. And so the title of the article is Sovereignty Over Judea and Samaria, Where Did It All Go Wrong? So let's run down through here, and let me give you a few excerpts from this article, and then if we got time, we'll talk about the Abraham Accords a little bit, the United Nations initiative that's going on, and the what's going on with the Biden administration. So with Donald Trump's, I should say former President Donald Trump's peace plan, the sovereignty clause in there included in President Trump's peace plan was supposed to turn the tide of history, but now it has been shelved. Obviously, there's a new administration came in, but this was actually shelved before that. The United States gave consent to a historic move, obviously back in January 28th, just over a year ago in 2020, when as part of its peace plan, it recognized, this is the President Trump's peace plan, it recognized Israel's right to apply sovereignty over the Jordan Valley and Israel's settlements in 1/3 of Judea and Samaria. This is the area captured by Israel in 1967. At the White House ceremony on January 28th, President Trump said, "We will form a joint committee with Israel to convert the conceptual map of that area out there into a more detailed and collaborated rendering so that recognition can begin immediately and we can achieve our goals." Well, the problem is the word immediately. That's one of the main problems. The one word would determine the entire future of that sovereignty clause, because all of the other Arab nations heard that word immediately and they thought, whoa, hold on, slow down. So despite Trump's explicit statements and Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's promises, to this day, the plan has not been implemented. And like I said, it's been shelved. And despite former senior White House advisor Jared Kushner's elusive comments, former United States Ambassador David Friedman and his assurances, the bold political move that was meant to turn the tide of history was shelved. So here's the question. How and why did that plan fail? Because a lot of people thought it was going to get done under President Trump. I mean, he had so much influence over Israel, and there had been so many concessions made to Israel. Trump was calling in all the favors, and why didn't something happen? Well, Netanyahu started entertaining the notion of applying sovereignty in Judea and Samaria all the way back in 2018. And at a Likud faction meeting, he said that he had been conversing with the U.S. on the subject for some time, but he stressed that one of the most important things was to maintain as much coordination with the U.S. as possible, and it was a connection with whom, obviously, there was this strategic asset to Israel and its settlements, because President Trump did not view the settlements as illegal, Israel occupying those out there like the international community did. And pretty much all of the previous administrations that had tried a peace initiative, Prime Minister Netanyahu knew that they viewed them as just like the international community. We need to go back to 67 borders. with land swaps. President Trump did not see it as that. So Prime Minister Netanyahu thought, hey, this is the time to get it done. So in a response uncharacteristic of the Trump administration, the White House quickly denied the allegations, and reports that the United States discussed with Israel an annexation plan for the West Bank, that they were false. White House spokesman Josh Raphael, he said that in a statement. So nevertheless, Netanyahu and his advisors, including former Israeli ambassador Ron Dermer, I should say ambassador to the U.S. at that time, Ron Dermer, he remained in close contact with President Trump, Kushner, Friedman, and all those guys, the presidential advisor, Jason Greenblatt, and they about formulating this sovereignty deal. So the plan was completed by the end of 2018. But Yisrael Beitenu leader Avigdor Lieberman in Israel, he bolted the coalition, forcing Israel into early elections. So in fear of being perceived as meddlers in Israelis' elections, a matter that constantly bothered Jared Kushner, the United States decided to delay the plan until Israel formed a government. No one could have predicted that Israel was about to plunge into 2 years of political turmoil, which led to several elections. So you can see that, knowing the details of the sovereignty plan full well, Prime Minister Netanyahu shared them throughout his campaign, but many perceived his remarks as just attempts to garner more votes ahead of the election. And it really became kind of a downward spiral. And I tell you what, I know we're coming up to a break, so when we get back from the break, we'll get into a lot more detail about
Move Mountains with Irvin Baxter. This book by Irvin's grandson provides 30 days of devotion that will enhance your relationship with God and others. Authentic illustrations from early morning devotions at Endtime will help you find your purpose and eliminate fears. Commit to taking this 30-day journey and experience real life change. Get your book for only $14.99. Call 1-800-363-8463 or go to endtime.com/move.
Major internet companies are silencing and censoring Christian voices online. These companies are trying to control what you see and hear. Almost 200 videos of ours have been marked as restricted online right now. That's why we launched End of the Age Plus, a platform where the truth won't be censored, a platform where we can preach the message of the gospel. When you subscribe to End of the Age Plus today for just $12.99 a month, you can watch all of our content in a secure, easy-to-view way from your favorite device. When you go to watch.endtime.com and subscribe, you'll get instant access to all of our teaching resources, including Revelation, the Unveiling of Jesus Christ, Understanding the End Time, End Time Magazine, and so much more. We will not censor our message to comply with what the world deems as politically correct. Go to watch.endtime.com right now or search End of the Age Plus in the App Store or Google Play.
If your station only carries the first 30 minutes of End of the Age, go to endtime.com and click the watch button to continue today's broadcast. You can also finish up later by clicking the archive button.
Okay, so knowing the details of the sovereignty plan full well, Netanyahu had shared them throughout his campaign, but nothing come to fruition. And because a lot of people thought, well, hey, he's just trying to garner more votes ahead of his election. And President Trump was following this very closely because Prime Minister Netanyahu had asked him, hey, this is going to meddle with the campaign. Let's hold off. And so President Trump was holding off. So another year went by. Israel was in the midst of its third election by the end of 2019, and President Trump was getting ready for his new presidential race at this point. So despite the political situation in Israel, the leaders decided to unveil the plan. Well, now we come to January 2020, and as the month this would be the month that the deal of the century would be presented to the public. And Netanyahu had requested that our ambassador to Israel, David Friedman, be the one to present the right-wing leaders with the main points of the deal and to mobilize their support. And because he was a very well-respected and he was trusted in the right-wing circles, so Friedman agreed to what was considered this historical plan at the time. So in the weeks leading up to the White House ceremony, Friedman spoke to the prominent figures in the right-wing media and the political system in Israel, and one of his key promises was the green light that Israel would be given to immediately. So here's the word again, to apply sovereignty over the Jordan Valley and the Israeli settlements in Judea, Samaria. The problem is immediately never happened. So until that moment, the notion of Israeli sovereignty over these regions was considered absurd because it was viewed by the international community as illegal. But Friedman's promises and the right wing's leaders, they sided with the move. And then Defense Minister Naftali Bennett, now these are all Israeli figures, he called the plans this Israeli's greatest political opportunity in the last 50 years. And Irvin Baxter and I were following this very, very, very closely, and we thought, you know what, man, this may be the one. I mean, this may be the deal that gets signed. Will bring because the Antichrist has to be involved somehow. Europe's got to be involved, the international community. And we were thinking, man, this just may be the deal that gets signed, but it didn't. So on Monday morning, January 27th, the day before they were going to present the plan at the White House, Netanyahu arrived in Washington with his advisors, Friedman and Likud, member of Knesset, Yariv Levin, who turned out had been involved in the drafting of the plan all along. Levine called the sovereignty plan groundbreaking on every level and an idea that had never been talked about before. And you guys followed a lot of this with us. President Trump's peace plan was totally unprecedented, things that he proposed in there. Some of it had been proposed before, but a lot of it had never even been proposed. So it was difficult at first to convince the U.S. of the logic behind the plan and the urgency of its implementation. But in the end, the conclusion was clear that they were going to recognize the sovereignty of the West Bank, which is very important because Israel has to be able to have defensible borders. So President Trump was never going to give the entire West Bank, which is what Joe Biden would like to do. He believes in a two-state solution back to 67 borders. President Trump was never going to do that under this plan. And so let me get down to where I want to get to here. Of course, the ceremony was held on January 28th at the White House. And Prime Minister Netanyahu, he was excited, enthusiastic, of course, but President Trump came across as kind of impatient, perhaps due to the stress of his impeachment trial that he was going through, and he was acquitted of, by the way, and many of you already know that. But immediately after, Prime Minister Netanyahu held a media briefing at the Blair House after the deal was signed, and he was over the moon about it. 3 years worth of hard work finally was going to bear fruit, and it was just a historic breakthrough that was really unparalleled since the 1967 Six-Day War, where Israel obviously was about to strengthen its position in Judea and Samaria. Judea and Samaria, the West Bank, you've got to understand where that's at. And I'll be showing you some maps, in the very near future on the program and things. But it's very important that you understand what an Israeli map looks like. This is very critical. So Netanyahu's advisor, Orich, he said, hey, sovereignty over the settlements on Sunday, because the word immediate, remember the word immediate, it kept coming up. But when immediate didn't happen, everybody started saying, oh, okay, maybe this was just something to garner votes, or maybe this was, have we been deceived? Or so people started wondering. So Jared Kushner, who was being interviewed by American media at the same time as Netanyahu, he was calling the journalist at the Blair House, and he expressed a different opinion. He clearly stated that the plan's implementation was not a matter of a few days, and that inconsistency became the sovereignty plan's second malfunction, because they said immediately originally, then there was Jared Kushner said, well, it's not going to be for a matter of a few days. It's going to be a while. Well, all of those Israel leaders had heard the word immediately. And so in Washington, the situation began to deteriorate somewhat. Not everybody, but some people began to think, hey, we were told immediately at the beginning of this thing. So there was the White House found out about a statement that was made. Let me see here if I can find this. The White House found out that the settlers and their leaders, they were idealistic people. But their behavior was they had said that they had acted childish, and it reflected on the lack of understanding of the political arena on their part. And so they said that in any case, the most pressing issue at the time was the inconsistency between Netanyahu and Friedman's timeline versus Kushner's. The former had said that sovereignty was on Sunday, and that Jared Kushner had said, well, sovereignty is going to be later after the election. This was Israel's election. So Levine said to this day that he didn't understand what happened. He said, it was clear to us the plan should be implemented immediately. Nobody in the administration denied that it had been that had been our conclusion. And when that same evening they requested a delay, the reason behind it was technical, to put maps in order, but both at the time and later that they showed no fundamental opposition. So a lot of things began to happen, and it kind of began to not unravel at that point, but people started to question things. And then the several weeks had gone by, and then the coronavirus situation happened. That began to reign over the world. The sovereignty missile was, let's say, so to speak, was deviating from its course and began to control centers in Jerusalem and in Washington, and still trying to take control of it. Everybody became not to be focused so much on this, the Israel situation, but on COVID. You remember what happened last year? And so the U.S.-Israeli Mapping Committee convened at the end of February in Israel, and in the upcoming weeks both before and after the Israeli election, the committee met several times and made significant progress. They were trying to map out the West Bank area that would be in part of the sovereignty plan and the annexation plan. Well, all during this time, the Arabs are watching this, and they're saying, hey, these people are fixing to annex parts of the West Bank into Israel. So despite all that, Netanyahu and the Trump administration continued to claim that the sovereignty plan was still on the agenda, even though they were dealing with COVID and elections and all this other stuff. So the mapping committee continued its work with many officials from Judea, Samaria, butting in to influence the final version of the plan. Hey, we need this area. That should be the Palestinians, and back and forth. But finally, by July 1, Irvin Baxter wrote a big article, hey, is annexation on July 1? Because this is what everybody was saying. But so there was July 1, the deadline was set forth by Netanyahu, and the committee had prepared 4 possible maps. So Israel had finally established a government by the end of June. This was of 2020. But by then, President Trump's domestic and international status had been undermined by the coronavirus, making Kushner even more reluctant to take some of the political risk that he was going to take. And at the same time, the U.S. gave blue and white leader Benny Gantz the right to veto the political process. And when speaking to the settlers, Benny Gantz, he's in the coalition government right now with Prime Minister Netanyahu, Gantz might have shown enthusiasm and support for the possibility of sovereignty, even encouraging them, but to the United States, his message was the complete opposite. And the same happened with Foreign Minister Gabi Ashkenazi. So according to Levine, the plan could still have been implemented at that stage, but the continued opposition on behalf of the Yesha Council in Israel eliminated all chances. The leadership needs to learn its lesson from missing out on its incredible opportunity, Levine said. So earlier in June of last year, the United Arab Emirates ambassador to Washington, Yusuf Al-Atoba, he suggested a proposal to suspend the sovereignty plan in lieu of a peace deal between Israel and the Emiratis. Because the article on the proposal, before the article on the proposal was published in Yedioth Ahronoth on June 12, it had already been passed on to former presidential assistant Avi Berkowitz, who gave it the green light. So at the end of June, now the annexation was supposed to happen July 1, you understand? At the end of June, Berkowitz arrived in Israel, met with Ashkenazi and Gantz and Netanyahu, and each one of them separately. And the first two spoke of their opposition to the plan, while the prime minister approved the conversation of the sovereignty plan into a peace agreement with the United Arab Emirates. And it was a process that had, in any case, been underway after years of behind-the-scenes negotiations with the United Arab Emirates in different countries. And so that day was the end of Israel's sovereignty plans. It was exchanged for a peace deal with the Emiratis. Now, you would know the peace deal as the Abraham Accords. And so it was farewell to the sovereignty plan until probably the next announcement on the matter of some new Republican administration decides to put that back on track. I mean, at this point, we simply don't know because, you know, President Trump is now former President Trump. You've got President Biden that's come into office, and he does not agree with this peace plan. He is on board with the Abraham Accords, and it appears that he has agreed to leave the embassy, the United States Embassy in Israel. I just saw where there's new plans that have come out to build a huge wing onto that embassy. And so there's a lot of things happening right now with what's going on. So I know we're coming up to another break here, and when we get back from the break, I'm going to get off into a little bit of the Abraham Accords, tell you what's going on prophetically speaking. We'll go through some of the scriptures, and then we'll talk about what the United Nations is doing.
Most of us walk around day by day blind to the prophecies being fulfilled right before us. Every news report brings a new piece to the puzzle in the race towards the final 7 years and the second coming of Jesus Christ. Now, more than ever, it is important for God's people to understand the times in which we are living. On November the 12th, 2013, we opened our Jerusalem Prophecy College in downtown Jerusalem. These same courses are now available online for people who are unable to attend the classes in person. We welcome students to join us and discover the link between current events and the prophecies of the Bible. Take your place in the prophecy of Daniel 11:33. Enroll in the Jerusalem Prophecy College today. Go to JerusalemProphecyCollege.com.
So when we heard the name Abraham Accords given to the peace agreement between Israel and the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, well, of course, you can imagine that we were excited because we knew that the President Trump's peace initiative had been put on a shelf at that point, that he was coming up to another election, and now we have the Abraham Accords that comes on the scene. And our question was, okay, now that the President Trump's deal has been put on the shelf, would the Abraham Accords be the prophesied agreement mentioned in Daniel 9:27? Because that's what we're watching for. Regardless of who gets the peace deal done, we know that there's going to be a peace deal in the near future. And when you talk about the Abrahamic covenant, what is that? Because the Bible says in Daniel 9:27 that he will confirm the covenant with many for a 7-year period. The covenant they're talking about there is the Abrahamic covenant. the Abrahamic covenant, 4,000 years ago, God entered into a covenant with Abraham. The pivotal event is recorded in all the way back in Genesis 15:18. The Bible says, in the same day the Lord made a covenant with Abraham, or it was Abram at that point. Name hadn't been changed to Abraham yet. And he said, Abram, unto thy seed have I given this land, from the river of Egypt all the way up to the great river, the river Euphrates. So this covenant made by God with Abraham promised the land of Israel would belong to Abraham and his descendants through Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob and that lineage forever. Because the Jews rejected Jesus when he came as their Messiah, the Jewish people were driven into exile from the Promised Land by the Romans in 70 A.D. And that exile continued for almost 2,000 years until the rebirth of Israel back in 1948. God began to reestablish the seed of Abraham in their Promised Land, and their surrounding Arab neighbors, they bitterly opposed the return to the Promised Land. But finally in 1979, Egypt, led by Anwar Sadat, he began the first Arab nation to sign a peace treaty with Israel. And 1 year later, Sadat paid with his life because of this action when he was assassinated by militants who hated Israel. And then, of course, in 1994, the country of Jordan signed a peace agreement with the Jewish nation. And still, though, 20 Arab nations steadfastly refused to establish relations with Israel or to acknowledge their right to Israel's right to exist. So that brings us to the Abraham Accords. Before his election, President Trump had declared the number one goal of his presidency would be to achieve a peace deal between Israel and her Arab neighbors. But President Trump tried two different things you've got to understand here. After 3 years of determined diplomacy, President Trump surprised the world by announcing a peace agreement between Israel and the United Arab Emirates. So he tried his deal on January 28th. It was announced, the deal of the century, the peace to prosperity deal between the Israelis and the Palestinians. But all along, he had also been working on the deal with the Arab nations around. And he was trying a regional agreement as well. So a lot of people didn't know about both things were going on, but Irvin Baxter and I were talking about it constantly on the radio. So President Trump really surprised the world by announcing a peace deal agreement between Israel and the United Arab Emirates. Now, this is why his other peace initiative had been shelved. This is where we started the Abraham Accords. And then, of course, the first one was with the United Arab Emirates. A few days later, Bahrain announced that they, too, would establish peace with Israel. And then on September 15th of last year, that's when representatives from Israel, the United States, United Arab Emirates, and Bahrain met in Washington, D.C. It was huge, beautiful celebration on the White House lawn, and that's where they signed the Abraham Accords. So when the name Abraham, when the name of the agreement was announced, people with the knowledge of the Abrahamic covenant, we were watching pensively over this, obviously, and we were really kind of amazed. It was shocked because nobody had said it was going to have anything to do with Abraham prior to this. So it is prophesied in the Bible that a peace agreement will be signed between the Israelis and the Palestinians just 7 years before the Battle of Armageddon and the physical return of Jesus to the earth. You know it. We've talked about it many times. Daniel 9:27, the Bible says, and he, the Antichrist, shall confirm the covenant, the Abrahamic covenant, with many for 1 week. And that's the New Century Version. It renders it 7 years. And in the midst of the week, he shall call the sacrifice and the oblation to cease. For the overspreading of abominations, he shall make it desolate, even until the consummation, and that determined shall be poured out upon the desolate. So the prophecy states the Antichrist will confirm the Abrahamic covenant with many for 7 years. And remember, the covenant made with God between Abraham decreed Abraham's seed would dwell in that land of Israel forever. The Abraham Accords that was just signed by Bahrain, the United Arab Emirates, back on September 15th of last year, it acknowledges Israel has a right to exist in the land given to them by the Abrahamic covenant. So obviously that, the question is, was the signing of the Abrahamic Accords, the confirmation of the covenant, marks the beginning of the final 7 years? Well, the answer to that very important question is no, at least not at this point. The signing of the peace agreement by Bahrain and the United Arab Emirates is not the completion of the Abraham Accords. Notice in the prophecy that the Antichrist will confirm the covenant with many, and after the accords are signed, that were signed on September 15th, President Trump said that there are many other Arab nations that are now anxious to sign on to the Abraham Accord, and this is expected to happen over the next few weeks, months, and years. And the most important signatory of all the accords would be the Palestinians, if they could get them on board. So what are the 5 characteristics? Because like I said earlier in the program, there have been so many peace initiatives over the years. And how will we know which one is the agreement that starts the final 7 years? Well, the completion of the Abrahamic Accord, according to prophecy, has 5 characteristics. The Palestinians must be included in the peace agreement. Okay? Right now, they're not. That's why I'm saying the Abraham Accords currently is not the agreement, but it could lead to the agreement with the Israelis and the Palestinians. 2, a Palestinian homeland is going to be established in Judea or the modern-day West Bank, but only a portion of it, because the Jews living in Judea currently will be allowed to live out there under the Palestinian jurisdiction as a minority out there. And then the Temple Mount is going to be placed under a sharing arrangement that will allow all religions to worship there. Israel's going to be allowed to build her 3rd temple. And the 5th one is that the Jews will remain undivided under Jerusalem, I should say, will remain undivided under Israeli control all the way to the Battle of Armageddon. And so once the Palestinians become part of the peace agreement containing these 5 characteristics, then the final 7 years to the Battle of Armageddon will begin, and that appears likely to occur just in the next few, probably, I don't want to say for sure when, but just in a very short period of time. Could it happen by the end of this year? They'd have to really get going, because Antonio Guterres is calling for the international community, the Middle East Quartet, to get back involved and to have an international peace agreement to try to get this thing solved. So that if they can start moving straight forward, now you've got the Abraham Accords that have come into play, and they could influence, those Arab neighbors could influence the Palestinians to come to a peace negotiating table. The United States has a lot of pull with Israel. We might be able to get something done very soon. The thing is that there are 2 prophecies that are to occur next on God's prophetic timeline, and that is this peace agreement that starts the final 7 years and the 6th trumpet war. And so it's always been our opinion, and I say this is opinion because I can't prove which one happens first scripturally. It's always been our opinion that the 6th trumpet war would happen first. Then, because of such a cry for peace on earth, that the international community would look at Israel and the Palestinians and say, okay, we're done. You guys are going to sign a peace agreement. We're tired of this conflict. That's when we're going to move off into a functioning world government, and a lot of things are going to happen during that time. You understand this could happen within the next very short period of time, year or 2, that we could move off into this. Could it happen by the end of this year? We'd have to really get moving on it. It absolutely could, but we'd really have to start scooting. Next year could be a great possibility. It really depends on when the 6th trumpet war happens. So at that point, this is speculation, but everything that's coming down right now, all the prophecies are converging at the same time. It can't be very far off. So, a lot of people say, well, hey, Daniel 9:27 says the Antichrist will confirm the covenant. Sure. The Antichrist will come from the European Union, the current European Union, which is the reborn Holy Roman Empire. So even if President Trump would have got a deal signed, let's say the peace deal in early January 2020, that he would have got that signed and between the Israelis and the Palestinians, and we moved off into that. Number one, it would have had the 5 characteristics to be the one that started the final 7 years, but also he would have had to have the international community, the European Union, all the nations that are involved in the UN Security Council. He would have had to have all of them involved to recognize this peace deal between the Israelis and the Palestinians. So we know that the Antichrist comes from Europe, not from the United States. So it couldn't have been President Trump. A lot of people have said, hey, if Donald Trump gets it done, it can be Donald Trump could be the Antichrist, or Jared Kushner, or Jason Greenblatt. No, because the Antichrist is not coming from the United States. The Antichrist, you can prove conclusively using Scripture that the Antichrist will come from the European Union, which is the reborn Holy Roman Empire. When in Daniel chapter 7, when the Bible says the little horn come up among 10, uprooted them, and he became great, speaking great things, that's the Antichrist. The 10 horns are a 10-nation alliance that will come from the European Union, the reborn Holy Roman Empire. The Bible's very specific on that. So at some point in the near future, Europe's going to be involved. So why is that so significant? Because now you have Guterres, who is the current Secretary General for the United Nations. He's calling for the UN, a quartet-led Israeli-Palestinian peace process. There's an article in the Jerusalem Post, you can go read it, that says the United Nations remains committed to supporting the Palestinians and Israelis to resolve the conflict and to bring an end to the suffering. This is what Guterres is saying, the Secretary General. And he said that the United Nations has thrown its support behind calls for an international peace conference under the auspices of the organization, and the United Nations, and the Quartet, which is part of the Quartet, which would resolve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict between the pre-1967 lines, which obviously Israel conquered in 1967. So now you can see how everything is coming down, and we've got the international community on board. And you've got the Quartet, which is made up of the United States, the European Union, Russia, and the United Nations. And they're calling for an international peace conference. So you can see how with all the prophecies converging at the same time.
This has been End of the Age, brought to you by the faithful partners of Endtime Ministries. If you're not currently a partner with Endtime Ministries, or if you would like more information, we invite you to call us at 1-800-ENDTIME. That's 1-800-363-8463, or visit us online at endtime.com.
Thank you for watching. If you liked this video, subscribe